In this video, I am going to briefly discuss some of the moral issues involved with conducting placebo-based clinical trials in developing nations. To begin, here are some of the conditions involved in a standard clinical trial. First of all, the trial is randomized. This means that every participant has an equal chance of either being in the experimental group or the control group. Secondly, the trial is double anonymous. This means that neither the researchers nor the study subjects are aware of which individuals are in the experimental group, nor which individuals are in the control group. Lastly, in a placebo-based clinical trial, the members of the experimental group receive the new drug or treatment, while the members of the control group receive a placebo. This means that members of the control group are not receiving a known effective treatment. There are several reasons why researchers might prefer to conduct clinical trials in developing nations as opposed to developed nations. One reason is that researchers usually will have a greater number of potential test subjects compared to those in more developed nations. Secondly, conducting clinical trials in developing nations is usually more cost-effective for several reasons. And lastly, the host nations typically have less legal restrictions than developed nations do. In fact, many of the clinical trials that are conducted in developing nations would be illegal if they were to be conducted in developed nations. Now, aside from concerns involving a placebo-based control group, there are other ethical concerns involved with just conducting clinical research in developing nations more generally. One of the major concerns has to do with informed consent. In order for study participants to give consent to participating in clinical research, they have to be both sufficiently informed and also demonstrate sufficient understanding of what this entails. However, due to various types of linguistic and cultural barriers, how should researchers ascertain when they have informed consent? The burden of proof is on the researchers to safeguard the informed consent of the participants, and not the other way around. Furthermore, many study participants operate on the assumption that they are receiving free medical treatment, and not necessarily that they are participating in a trial. Another concern involves whether or not the potential subject's participation involves a type of coercion. For many individuals, participating in a trial may be their only chance of getting any kind of medical care. But if potential participants would prefer not to participate if they had other options for care available, there may be some type of coercion or manipulation involved. There is also concern about what kind of care will be available to individuals after the clinical trial has ended. If participants have no guarantee of receiving further care after the trial has ended, then even those who are receiving treatment really do not have a legitimate chance of their condition improving in the long term. So at best, participation in the trial gives participants some temporary reprieve, and at worst, gives them a sense of false hope. With respect to the use of placebos in clinical trials, the World Medical Association Statement of Helsinki says that placebos are only acceptable when there is no acceptable or proven intervention available. However, it is ambiguous concerning whether the statement is referring to what is somewhere available globally or what is practically or locally available. According to bioethicist Baruch Brody, this statement should be understood in terms of what is practically or locally available to participants. If researchers are required to provide treatments that are available somewhere, then clinical research will be too costly to implement. But clinical research is vital for the development of more effective treatments. According to Brody, most individuals in developing nations have little to no medical treatment that is practically or locally available. Again, for many individuals, participating in the clinical trial may be their only chance at receiving any form of treatment. However, this means that in having a placebo-based control group, researchers are not failing to provide participants with an acceptable or proven intervention that is practically available. Since researchers would not be failing study participants by having a placebo-based control group, Brody argues that placebo-based controls satisfies the requirements laid out by the Statement of Helsinki, and hence, the use of placebo-based controls in developing nations is morally justified. Baruch Brody also says similar things about the nature of potential coercion in such clinical trials. According to Brody, in order for an act to be coercive, there has to be some threat of harm or some threat to make one's current state worse. However, those who participate in clinical trials only stand to benefit from their participation, and even if a participant is in a placebo-based control group, their situation will not be made worse by being placed in the control group. So according to Brody, again, since there is no threat of harm or threat to make one's current state worse, clinical trials in developing nations that involve placebos are not coercive. One of the more obvious concerns involved with clinical research in developing nations is that it is inherently exploitative. Somehow, it involves taking an unfair advantage of others. Addressing concerns of exploitation, Baruch Brody himself makes the distinction between taking an unjust advantage of others and simply taking advantage of an unjust situation. Since the researchers themselves are not directly responsible for the unjust conditions that citizens of developing nations find themselves in, and since participants do stand to benefit somewhat from the participation, Brody thinks that clinical research of this kind is more taking advantage of an unjust situation more than it is further perpetuating an injustice. Is Brody correct about this, though? What reasons are there for arguing that these conditions are exploitative? First and foremost, clinical research in developing nations takes advantage of a population's vulnerabilities. The fact that the sort of clinical research that takes place in developing nations is illegal in developed nations is a clear indication of this fact. In doing clinical research in developing nations, researchers are giving members of vulnerable populations an irresistible offer, since it may be their only chance at receiving treatment. But again, if the individuals that are participating would prefer not to participate if they had other options available, there is some reason to think that coercion is involved, even if individuals are not being threatened with harm. Secondly, it's also the case that participants are not the ones who stand to directly benefit from the research itself. 90% of the drugs that are tested in developing nations end up benefiting members of developed nations. In this regard, the trial participants are simply being used as a means to an end. These sorts of practices fail to recognize the humanity of the individuals involved, and as such, these practices are deeply dehumanizing. Lastly, although the researchers themselves are not directly responsible for the unjust conditions in which the trials are taking place, the developed nations that the researchers represent are culpable for those unjust conditions. To the extent that the researchers would not be able to conduct their research in this way were it not for the injustices involved, the researchers do further perpetuate injustice by conducting their research in this way. The World Medical Association and other healthcare organizations have made efforts to make the guidelines for clinical research in developing nations much stricter, especially when it comes to ensuring that trial participants will receive care once a clinical trial has ended. Among other things, it is paramount that clinical researchers bear in mind that their research is being done for the benefit of humanity, and the humanity and autonomy of trial participants must be given priority in all forms of clinical research.